Good morning, everybody. I hope you're having a awesome beginning to an awesome weekend. Today is Good Friday, and I know that over these years I've never really given an Easter message. Um, and you know what? I am, as you guys know, a big fan of mythology and archetypal psychology, Jungian psychology. That's kind of what drives me, what enlivens me, what inspires me. And I do when I'm working with my families and conjuring up how I'm going to maybe facilitate a group, or maybe even more than that, how I'm going to inspire myself in order to really be of any use. I do pay attention to what's going on in the community and around the world in terms of different holidays that are taking place. I mean, holidays take place for a reason, and there's massive amounts of energy um, and thoughtfulness, if you will, just a lot of psychological energy that is configured around all these holidays. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist. And so I often put together themes and topics around that um, that can that families and people can benefit from or almost align with, so they too can be inspired, so they too can receive the energy um, that that this time of year can bring. Unfortunately, as we all know, our lives can be, like I say, our lives can be very busy, but our minds and our hearts can be very busy as well because we get preoccupied. You know, uh, you know, think of an occupation, or it's kind of like a vacancy that existed and it gets filled, and our minds and our hearts get filled with other things, and then we, I guess you could say, feel disheartened and disconnected, not really part of the spirit of what is going on, whether, whatever is going on in our families, communities, nations. Now, I wanted to give this Easter message because it just seemed like not only was I inspired, and then it hit me just after I wanted to do this. I thought, well, this whole COVID thing is going on as well. How can I fit this into the message? And it seemed to fit really well. And so I was kind of thinking about this theme. It's like kind of the nature and spiritual nature of crisis and trauma, because that's where we are right now. That's where we've been for the last couple of months. You know, uh, our world, if you will, has been in a state of disruption, maybe even upheaval. There's People are experiencing tremendous amounts of stress and distress, and I'm that is putting it lightly, isn't it? Because this disruption is not only financially and even kind of mentally in terms of increased levels of anxiety, but people are actually dying. People are actually, people are families are losing family members. We're losing friends. Um, I've said this to many families this week and over the last few weeks. We're kind of in the unknown. This is territory that is very unknown to most of us. So this leads me to kind of going into this discussion a little bit, and I'm going to combine kind of like this kind of counseling psychological world, and I've got a message in here for counselors and for other professionals who are in this field, but it's also a message for everybody. And I'm going to bring to this a few definitions that may be helpful, uh, and I think we do need, if you will, something uplifting at this particular time. But in terms of the Easter theme, it is Good Friday, right? It's something good is coming, but something else is going to come first, isn't it? Right? So this whole Easter story is just perfect for what we're going through right now with COVID-19. So let me jump into this for you. And bear with me because I've kind of written like 5 or 6 pages down, which I rarely do, but I want to try to stay with that too. So first of all, what is a crisis or a trauma? Now, I know that's just a humongous, you know, kind of topic and can be approached from so many different areas, but I try to keep it simple and just do my little piece in my own little corner of the world. And one simple definition of a trauma that I give to people is this. Here's our working definition. It's an abrupt separation from our expectations. An abrupt separation from our expectations. Okay? So, again, that's very, sterile, academic. It's putting it mildly. But sometimes simple is the best way to see things. And what I'm offering you is an opportunity to take a position with me here. See if you can kind of get on board with where I'm going. If some of you have watched my videos, you know this is a definition that we use a lot. You're welcome to take the conversation or define that differently, and that'll fit for different conversations. But for this conversation, I want to say that our working definition is, again, an abrupt separation from our expectations. Okay. So basically speaking, I guess you could say we're all familiar with that. When it kind of hits the fan, when we're under stress, especially when we're in distress or experience some trauma, what are the basic responses to that? Well, I was thinking, basically fight, flight, or freeze, right? But either way you look at it, these responses are kind of natural and instinctive. They don't require a lot of thought, and they're often extreme, and they're aimed, really to serve one purpose, and that's the individual's personal survival. So when we're in high levels of distress, when we're traumatized, we could say we used to just do the two, right? Fight or flight, but now it's fight, flight, or freeze. So we ask ourselves, okay, well, if this is all about personal survival from what? What's the threat? Well, the one of the things that I've really come to appreciate when I've looked at trauma and just kind of the human experience of even coming to the planet, one of the things that creates the most anxiety in the human psyche, one of the greatest threats to the psyche, is the unknown. The unknown. And, when we are sitting in no man's land, the mind tends to want to start to create narratives. So what was once unknown, we try to give some meaning to. But for now, look at how, people, communities, nations in the world have responded to COVID-19, right? It came upon us rather suddenly. Hold on, I'm going to let my dog out. You better get out. Go get him, Nanners. She doesn't care that I'm doing my Easter message. But look at how the world is responding to COVID-19. This whole COVID-19 thing came upon us rather suddenly. In fact, very abruptly. For most of us, boom, it was like almost overnight. We hear a little bit coming out of China, and then boom, here it is, right? And it's caused, in our most basic thoughts and routines, it's caused disruption. And again, it's been very abrupt. And so can you see how I'm bringing together, pulling that definition into how things can be considered traumatic or can be what we call, a crisis? You have to ask yourself, what is the crisis? Like, what is the trauma? Is it the actual thing that's happening, or is it the disruption? Is it this abrupt separation from what I've expected? This abrupt separation from my, not only physical routines, but from my mental ones. So, also consider this, that the source of the disruption was not well known. So at first, COVID-19, we hear about it. It's this kind of mysterious entity that we know very little about, right? But what we do know, it's a virus. Some small little microscopic thing, but this small little thing had the capacity to abruptly disrupt the entire world. That's pretty freaky, right? That's one of the things people are wrestling with. It's kind of like the enemy. Like when you can see your enemy, that's fine, but when you can't, that's really weird. And not only can you not, not really see the enemy unless you have a special tool or whatever, but it's a lurking enemy as well, you know, and it's an unknown enemy, and you don't know really the capacity of it, just that it does have the capacity at this point to disrupt the entire world. And so as scientists and doctors kind of apply all their great knowledge and resources, they start to construct a bit of a story, a bit of a narrative, right, as to what this menace might be, right? And I say might be because from day one, I mean, right here we are, we're confronted with this unknown entity that is menacing, that is disruptive, etc. And we don't know a lot about it. And the greatest minds in the community come together to try to kind of name it and frame it up for us so we can understand what we're up against. And of course, while all this is going on, what's the main response? We're all taking one basic response, aren't we? Freeze. Stand still. Freeze. Why? Because we needed to do that until we figure out more about this, right? But every day, we listen to the news, scientists and doctors, and are giving us more and more information about what they think is going on, what this virus is capable of, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we don't really know. I mean, we don't really have a good idea right now how long this is going to last. We don't really, and they're starting to say, well, the virus now has potential capacity to spread in ways that we didn't know were possible before. So just as we're starting to create this narrative and this idea that, we might be able to know something, boom, it kind of evades being known, right? So many hypotheses out there about what might be, but we're told it may have abilities that we yet don't even know about. It may be even able to defy our best efforts. So in the meantime, what do? Freeze, right? But you can see kind of our human response. You can start to see our human response towards something that we don't know, right? The unknown. That's our best response. Freeze. All right. So, maybe freezing, isn't such a bad idea. And so we freeze. But as we freeze, we grapple with some very, very fundamental questions about ourselves, about our families, our communities, and our nation and our world, and our place in it. I mean, is that not true? I hope that during this time of freeze, this time of isolation, which I like to think of as solitude, is that we are, I guess you could say, offered the opportunity. Not everybody will take the opportunity, but offered the opportunity to ponder some very, very primal, fundamental questions about ourselves, about our communities and our families in our world. It may even be that finally we come face to face with some very fundamental truths. Face to face. So, what's one possible truth, if you will? I think one could be is that we ultimately don't know a hell of a lot. That we will be confronted, that we will come face to face with situations in our lives that are beyond our present understanding. Or maybe that will always be beyond our understanding. That in stress and the stress of the unknown, we get to see our instinctual and natural responses. We get to see how our desire for personal survival penetrates and permeates our entire life and our relationships. We get to see how infantile and how impotent we really are. But we also get tested. We get to see what we're truly made of. It's been said that you can tell more about a person not from how they act, but from how they react. It's kind of where the wheat gets separated from the chaff, where the cream rises to the top. You get to see what you're made of, really. We only get to see what we're made of when it hits the fan. We only get to see what we're made of when we get tested, how we react to certain things. How are you reacting? How is your family reacting? It's instinctual to fight, flight, or freeze. It's instinctual to become survival oriented and to kind of retract and retreat into a personal survival mode. That's all natural and instinctual. This is a time for where people can come face to face with themselves. This is how the cream rises to the top. This is how pure gold is made, by being tested in the fire. So we get tested. We also get to see our biases and our leanings, what we turn to. In fact, if we're blessed, I want to say if we're blessed, we get a glimpse of the very roots of where we put our faith. You hear me? We get to see our biases. What are we biased towards? What are we prone to? What do we lean towards? That's what gets revealed when it hits the fan, when the stress levels go up, when distress is present. But if we're blessed, and this is sometimes a blessing only on the wise or the mature, you get a glimpse of the roots of your character and where they're grounded in, what you're rooted in. In other words, where your faith is. As a family counselor, and you guys have heard me say this many, many times, about how often we use the word up when we're referring to families, or we're referring to being parents and being disciplinarians, and we use the word up a lot. That we're grown-ups, that we're raising up, that we're bringing up. We use that word up a lot, even physiologically. We know if little kids are developing properly, if they're grasping onto things and pulling themselves up, we want people to stand up and to stand on their own 2 feet. Everything is up, up, up. But I also regularly hear children and even adults, when they look back into their lives, children and teens saying, I wish I had somebody to look up to. Or I might be talking to an adult who's looking back into their childhood and saying the same thing. I sure wish I would have had somebody to look up to. And then I might ask them, when do you wish this the most? When do you wish, or when is your wish the greatest, that you would have somebody to look up to? When things are going good, or when things are going not so good? And of course, their greatest wish, they wish that the most, if you will, when things were going bad, when stress was high, when they were facing the unknown. That's when their desire to look up was the greatest. Isn't it true? I mean, we talk about parents and other adults being role models, and children, whether it be physically or whether it be cognitively or what have you, emotionally, are not as big. And so we're constantly talking about having something to look up to. We don't ever say, I wish I had something to look down to. Although the idea of vertical is still there, because when we're going to talk about this, we talk about looking up or looking down. In other words, looking deep. But just know that this is built in us. We want something to look up to. And in times of crisis and stress, we get to see what we do look towards, our biases, what we lean towards, where our attachments are, where our faith is. What happens when people, for whatever reason, and those reasons are important to investigate, but for whatever reason, people, I guess you could say, experience a disappointment when a child doesn't have an adult, when they think they don't have an adult to look up to, when an adult person looks back into their life, or even as adults, we're still looking up, and it just doesn't seem there that there's anything to look up to. Sometimes we say we need something to look forward to. I think that's in some ways another way of saying look up to, but we use the word forward, which that really doesn't describe our deepest desires. But what happens when people have that feeling that they don't have anything to look up to? I'm going to say that I think when they reject what Robert Bly called the vertical gaze, people start to infatuate on what's horizontal. And that's primarily themselves. We live in an era right now where narcissism and arrogance is just, in the sense of entitlement, is just at an all-time high. But if that were helpful, to reject the vertical gaze and become infatuated with the horizontal gaze, you think that as a society we would be becoming more psychologically resilient. But research is just not showing that. We're seeing sharp increases in anxiety, depression, suicide, addiction. So there's clearly something amiss here, something wrong. But this is kind of what happens. We reject a vertical gaze. Maybe it starts when we're young or what have you. We were looking up to people and they didn't show up for us in the way that, so that's a trauma, right? That's an abrupt separation from an expectation. When I expected somebody to show up for me in a certain way, they didn't, and we make a decision. We reject the vertical gaze and we turn to ourselves. That's primarily what people often do when they feel let down by other people. They say, well, I'll never trust people again, or I'll never trust adults, or I'll never trust women or men or whatever. And because I've basically rejected everybody else through my judgment that everybody's untrustworthy, the only one I can trust by default is myself. And there now I've got my infatuation with myself in my horizontal gaze. I guess you could say it's an instinctual, natural response, but it also leaves me very alone. Okay. So, as I just mentioned, unfortunately, when somebody makes a decision like that to reject that vertical gaze, it kind of cuts themselves off from what would have saved them. Again, instinctually, naturally, one would say, well, screw that. I'm not going to, look up anymore. Just going to look to myself. But that was an error in judgment. The answer to that is to not stop looking up, but it's to look higher and deeper. A tree's roots don't deepen when there's an abundance, when there's an abundance of rain, when there's an abundance of, when conditions are just right. The roots of a tree deepen when there's drought, when those things are not available. Can you imagine a tree in a drought situation making a decision to retract its roots? Wouldn't that be suicide? When a tree is under distress, or when it's been traumatized and it decides to retract, it maybe decides to not try anymore, to let its roots atrophy, that would be certain suicide. So when confronted with the unknown, there'll be some temptations to retreat, to revert back. However, in this temptation, if you're blessed, if you stand still, if you're willing to look deeper, you'll receive a glimpse of where you've put your faith and where you're infatuated. And in this glimpse, both an opportunity to see your error in judgment, but also an opportunity to look up again. You see, this is what life is much about, folks. We make decisions in life that are really errors in judgment. Many, many people have made that decision to not look up anymore, but to only look to themselves, or to look to government, or to look to others. And the truth is that, as people like to say very glibly, nobody's perfect. We're going to let each other down. And, it's forgivable for a young child to want to look up to a parent. We say, that's kind of the foundation of all attachment theory. That when we're little, we need big people in our lives who treat us decently and take care of us, so we get a good sense of our own self-worth and know that the world is a safe place. But one of the other things about attachment theory, it says that when a young person has a good attachment to something bigger than itself that's trustworthy, it can be adventurous. That's what little kids do. They venture out. They get traumatized, if you will. Something happens. They come back to that source, that bigger source, for protection, for nourishment, for revitalization. And then they go back and adventure again. They don't retract. They keep moving, but it all has to do with that thing that they're looking up to. That's how we start our lives. But that's not the end of the story when it comes to human development. Human development is a vertical movement in which we finally realize that none of us are perfect. And we don't give up because we've once put our faith in somebody, in a human being who's let us down. We go higher, we go deeper. That's the adventure. That's the adventurous nature of who we are as human beings. We don't just stop because we've been hit hard with something. We pick ourselves up and we move into the unknown. We move towards something else. Maybe we have a sense that there is still more. There's something there. Right? We keep moving. We pick ourselves up. And, when we can do that, we have a chance to do what? To rise up. There's that word again, up. We rise up. So we have both have, the first has to happen before the second. We first have to see the error in our judgment, what we've rejected. When people reject their parents for whatever reason, it's kind of like, because parents are almost like the two legs that you walk on when you move forward. And of course, people have lots of reasons that they would reject their parents. But when you reject your parents, it's almost like you're crippling yourself. You hobble through life. You're lame. You can't move as quick as you could if one has solid narratives, if you will, relationships there. And those, as we get older, can be recreated. We can get another opportunity. We can take an inventory of our judgments and decide to retract them, our judgments, which opens up another opportunity to reconnect, to look up again, to see something better, and to rise up. But first, there's the dark, if you will. What's going to be dark for us. That's why a lot of people don't rise up, is because they don't want to do that work of accountability. Where have I made those judgments? And until people do that, they're blaming everybody else. But when we get blessed, and I say it's a blessing, it's a blessing saved for truth seekers, for the wise, for the mature. That the doorway to freedom, the doorway to rising up, is through being honest and accountable. But that leads to what? Humility. Humility is so, so important. Now let me give a message here to everybody, but especially to my colleagues who are in the field. People ask me all the time, and I used to provide clinical supervision for master's degree students who were doing their internships, and they would ask me, John, but everybody asked me this question, just a matter of time, how do you do it? 30 plus years of counseling, working with at-risk populations, people who have, mental health issues and substance abuse issues and serious trauma and domestic violence and, huge amount of family conflict. I mean, how can you be in the presence of that much pain and agony for 30 plus years? And I say, I mean, let me tell you, it's been hard fought in a certain way, but the fight has not been with what is the reality of how people present themselves. The reality has been with my errors in judgment. I mean, that's where I do the work. That's what the issue is. It's not with the reality of how people present. It's the reality how I present it. The ideas that I've brought into the situation. I was young once, and I think it's really important that people have enthusiasm, that people want to go out and make a difference. Absolutely. The time is now. Time is always now. Go out and, and do your thing. I mean, but it is the hero's journey, right? It's the journey, it's the journey that calls the hero. The hero doesn't select the journey selects the hero. And each and every one of you are going to be on that hero's journey, which has many, many twists and turns and traps. And so maybe I'm a little bit towards the end of my journey now. In at least in this phase of my life. There'll be another one coming up here soon, but people do ask me all that, how do you do it? I say, well, right now I can tell you, be thankful. What do you mean be thankful? Well, think of it in times like this. It's COVID-19. Be thankful. Be thankful for the truth. As I was saying earlier, when I was describing the COVID-19 experience that we're all in, what should we be learning? I say should be. I very rarely use that word, but I hope that people are learning. It's kind of like that we, in our present moment, are in the presence of something unknown. Best we can do is freeze. We're in the presence of something bigger than what we know. Okay, well, remember, life is like that. When we were little, we were in the presence of a lot of things that we didn't know. But how did we handle it? We looked up. We looked up to a greater source of wisdom. And when we were little and we looked up to that greater source of wisdom, our parents, we could feel confident. We could pick ourselves up and go out and play. We could pick ourselves up and go have another adventure. It took the weight off of our shoulders. Like, do you know how many service providers and how many agencies are out there right now with the weight of the world on their shoulders? It's a terrible weight, I tell you, to carry. But I did it. Many of you will. But if you're going to be in the industry for any length of time, if you're going to be able to put in 30 years or more, if you want to fulfill your heart's desire and be in the trenches and, be that clinician or therapist or social worker or whatever, and you're going to want to spend time with people who are in high levels of distress and agony and pain, which if you weren't there, it would be a waste of your time on the planet. So you got to figure out how to get there. But things are paradoxical. You can't be there and carry the weight of the world. That's what I found out, because I was carrying the weight of the world. And I see people do it all the time. I see clinicians do this all the time, going well beyond the job description, going well beyond the mandates of what they're to be doing. I've always found myself as this family counselor or a counselor in some capacity, and I'm just this little speck of something. That's what I've come to realize. I say to people as I laugh because, and I smile because I'm experiencing the joy. I'm experiencing the freedom, and I'm experiencing a confidence, not in myself, but in something bigger than myself. Just like I was explaining, when we stand in the presence of this current situation, COVID-19, and we realize how small we are, and our simple, natural, instinctual attempts to deal with it by freezing, that's the best we can do. But I want to say also to not just clinicians, but to agencies and businesses that they're part of, people are also going to try to fight and flight. We tend to want to exaggerate oftentimes the defense mechanisms, the coping strategies that we use. And there will be people who are overreacting. Really, the answer is really in something I was mentioning earlier called solitude. Be in solitude. Don't freeze up, but be still. Much of the information that's coming out that's available for families and individuals, what do they recommend? They don't recommend doing anything crazy, but they recommend just stay methodical. Slow it down, really take care of yourself. Stick to simple routines that you might be familiar with. But in some places, in some parts of the government or other places and businesses, they might be scrambling right now. Because I think this is what happens when people haven't come to terms with their place in the world. They try to carry this burden that's just too heavy, and unfortunately they pass it on to others, their stress and their anxiety. Instead of saying, this is a time to slow down, this is a time for solitude, this is a time to take a look at where your faith is, where your biases are, what you lean on. What are you looking at? Are you looking at the tragedy? Are you looking at potential tragedy? Or do you see something better? Because this is a time to reclaim your error in judgment. And this is a time to, I guess you could say, also reclaim your right to look up. To reclaim what is right is to look up. It's a paradoxical joy. I look at myself and that I'm just a small speck in something that we call change. Thank God. This is what I say now. This is what I share with people. Thank God. Thank God that I'm just a small speck of something, and that I can be in awe of looking at something much greater than myself. The families that I've worked with all these years and different people, they were living a life before I engaged them, and they'll live a life way after. You think about it, like maybe I do a 1 hour session or hour and a half, what have you, once a week. Really, that's just a speck of sand in what really comes together to help people change. Isn't that the reality of it? I've looked at places where I've changed, and places where I haven't changed. It's not usually just one thing. I mean, I work with families who have engaged many resources, have met many counselors, have met many support services. It's all in their head. There's no shortage of resources, but they just kind of haven't come quite together completely yet. Change, this thing we call change or transformation or healing or recovery, is something that if we truly saw the nature or truly saw what it really is, if we stood in its presence, we would see how small we are. We would see that we're almost insignificant. But yet, people rise up. We've risen up. People have risen up, and it had nothing to do with me, or very little, if at all, to do with me. That is a source of joy. It's a miracle. You can take a breath and go, yes, life is good. I'm standing in the presence of the unknown. My mind can't get my head around this, but I'm so glad for it. You see, that paradoxical acceptance of one's, if you will, smallness in the picture leads to that humility. And in humility, what you get invited back into is awe and wonder. Awe and wonder. There's no best practice that's going to help you with that. We should know that by now as clinicians, because best practice has been something that we've heard forever. And we all try to pursue it and implement it to really show what at the end of the day? And yet we all do our small part. And believe me, it is very small. And I say believe me because there's a paradoxical freedom. There's a paradoxical joy. And it's a joy that comes from feeling that you can be part of something way bigger than what you even know. And so that's become my faith. In awe and wonder, as I did as a child when I looked up to my parents who are no longer with me. I can now look up to something bigger. And the thing that I look up to that it's bigger is something they looked up to. And so I can feel proud. If you want to call it to become an adult or to become an elder, to become what my parents were. And if you have parents who weren't able to do that, imagine how proud of you they would be if you went to the next level. To rise up. To look up. This is the Easter story. It's a story of how we rejected the vertical gaze. How we became infatuated with ourselves and our knowledge while at the same time suffering. And it's an opportunity to stand in the presence of a light that exposes, if you will, that helps us see the error in our judgment. And in so doing, we can make anew. We can make a new pledge, a new allegiance. We can understand that the only way to really be free and to really be available to people in the way we want to be available is by having that allegiance to something greater than ourselves. But yes, there is a reduction in ourselves. That's the beauty. That's the, if you will, psychological beauty of it all. It's kind of like the old Batman thing. With great power comes great responsibility. In other words, with great power comes great humility. With great freedom comes great humility. If you want to return back to seeing the world as miraculous and and stand in awe again, then it's paradoxical and it's the road of humility. This is the message, if you will, that I have brought to young people who are coming into the field or into with parents excuse me, who seem to have lost the love that they had for their children or for their spouse. You want to get back to that love? Then let's take a look at the errors in your judgment. But in so doing, you'll be offered an opportunity through humility to reconnect with something way better. Way better. You'll be able to rise up. You'll be made anew. And so at this time of year, this is the opportunity. As I mentioned, I'm a fan of the great myths, if you will, and these opportunities for us as a community, as a world, as in our families, to make a transformation. It doesn't have to go on and on and on. A sense of joy, a sense of confidence that you could connect to beyond the horizontal circumstances in your life is available to you. You just have to reach out for it. Reach for it. Reach up again. We in the parent leadership group, we talk a lot about the existence of a true self. Some people might call it their best self. And it's when we study that, if you will, it just even in our own simple way, we know that our true self, our authentic self, the God, the Christ, whatever it is that you're looking up to, has no condemnation for you. This is just a time of joy and a time to rise up. And like a small child reaching up to its parent once again. And a good parent doesn't imprison or condemn its child. It helps soothe its child and nourishes its child and then releases it to have the next adventure. So, no condemnation. It's your great opportunity. So, I thank you all for bearing with me for this first ever Easter message. I'm blessed to be able to share this with you, and yes, and to be here at this moment and this day in our history. And for us here in the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia, we're enjoying and have been enjoying beautiful sunny weather. My garden is abloom, and although we are in lockdown and isolation, it's beautiful. The solitude, as many people are saying, the birds that are chirping louder, the wildlife that's come closer. Here where I'm at, it's so common to have deer and other wildlife right in our neighborhoods. And, just saw 3 deer yesterday just grazing on grass like it was nothing. There's a calmness that settled in. So here we are on Good Friday. It's just the beginning. As we know, like with COVID, it was the beginning, and there was challenge and darkness and distress. But the light is there as well. And we will rise up, and you will rise up, but it's going to have a lot to do with your gaze. What are you looking at? Where do you have your eyes fixed? Your heart. Make sure that, I've always said to parents, choose wisely where you take up residence. because it's from where you take up residence in your heart and in your mind. That's how you're going to see the world. That's how you're going to make meaning of the world. That is so unique to us as human beings, people. It's so unique. It's divine that we make meaning. So be very careful what you're looking at. And if you're not looking up, if you're not looking at a source of wisdom that's bigger than you, then I want to suggest that's a little bit like standing on thin ice. And in times like this, with COVID or whether you're losing a job or a marriage or illness or whatever it is you're going through, trials like this will reveal the shortcomings oftentimes in where we've put our faith. Where it'll reveal to us what we're looking at, what we're attached to, what we're infatuated with. And we'll find out, hey, some of those things that I look towards are pretty shallow, and it's kind of like saying, for instance, how we all manage our stress. Some people turn to, let's say if you were somebody who turned towards video games or social media, and then the stress level goes up, and you might try to turn to that thing even more, but it's not going to give you the satisfaction anymore. It's just not enough. And so the shallowness of it, the limitation of it gets revealed. But it's like the tree that's in drought. It will challenge you to deepen your roots, to to not give up on looking up, but to look farther, look higher, and let go of the things that you were hanging on to. So again, thank you for this opportunity. Have a wonderful holiday weekend, and stay well.